Well, a pleasant good morning to all of you, here in the building and joining us on Zoom or online. We are glad to have you here, glad to have our visitors here. Smith and his family, his parents have been here 62 years living in this area, and we're glad that you're here, glad that you've come our way. Glad that you're all here. This is a beautiful day. Beautiful weather. Last night, when I was getting ready to go to bed, I could hear rain, and it's good that God has blessed us with some rain, and pray that it continues. But God is good all of the time, and we're all blessed by God in many ways. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I would invite you, if you have a Bible, to turn or scroll, if you have your smartphones or iPads, to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and we're going to look at the last section of chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. I hope that you've been enjoying these studies and looking through this book. I plan on going into chapter 2. Sometimes it can be fatigue and just studying one book. So if that is the case, you can just let me know. But it's been great, great to study through this book. And as you're turning there, I just want to again express my thanks to giving me this opportunity to serve you in Bible classes and in preaching. It's an honor to do that, and I just want to thank you. It's a real privilege to work with Bill. I like the comments that he makes, especially in Bible class. It's very profound, and it's such an honor to be working with you, Bill. I do appreciate your knowledge and using that knowledge to serve God. When you think of, there's a preacher I used to study with, Bob Waldron, and he would often talk about different things, and he said, the world has enough doctors and lawyers, but the world needs more preachers. And so if you're going to use your knowledge, use it in serving God that way and bringing souls to Christ. And so you look at somebody like Bill that has a lot of knowledge, but to use that knowledge, that God-given ability in serving God, is a good thing. Well, like I said, we have been studying Ecclesiastes. And in this great book by Solomon, Koheleth the preacher, he doesn't call himself Solomon, but this to me is a sermon that Solomon would give. And the reason I say that, he says the words of a preacher. And so this is going to be, if this were anything, this would be Solomon's sermon. And in chapter 1, he asks questions in the very beginning. Is life worth living? And we answer in the affirmative. Yes, it's worth living when you have a relationship with God. God puts everything into perspective. Then the preacher declares that nothing changes, and he uses elements of the earth. He uses the earth itself, the sun, the wind, and the sea as examples that nothing changes in nature, that it's all been the same throughout time. But God can break through nature and do remarkable things for his people, and we have seen examples of that in his word. Then he reminds us that nothing is new in this world, and that's true. Nothing is new. There is nothing new under the sun, he would say, but it's really just a recombination of the old. But even though nothing is new, the great and powerful God can make new creatures out of sinners in his Son. And so we come to the end of this chapter where Solomon says that nothing can be understood. Nothing can really be understood. And this is his wisdom here that we are going to be looking at. So now the preacher moves from historian to philosopher, and he tells how he went searching for the answer for the problems that grieved him. Now, Solomon, being the king of Israel, he possessed great wealth, and he had all of the resources necessary to experiment with different solutions, to see what really made life worth living. In chapter 2, he tells us that he tried various pleasures. He also accomplished great works, and he accumulated for himself great possessions. And what was the result of all of that? Well, in verse 14 in chapter 1, he said, it is all vanity and striving after the wind. All that he could have ever accomplished, he said, it's meaningless. There's no real value to it. Before launching into his experiments, though, Solomon took the time to think this matter through. After all, Solomon was the wisest man of his time, and he applied all that God-given wisdom to the problem. So in verse 12, he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. And here is his conclusion. And I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the sun. And it was a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. Solomon begins by telling us that life is tough, but it is a gift from God. Solomon describes life as a sore travail, right? He says, I had set my mind on all of the wisdom concerning what has been done. It is a grievous task. All the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. This sore travail or grievous task only caused Solomon fatigue. We need to realize, though, that in the beginning, life was not that way. It wasn't what God destined for man. And we know that because after God creates man and woman, in Genesis 2, when he introduces marriage, right? In verse 24, this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And then listen to this verse, and the man and woman were both naked and not ashamed. So when God created man and woman and he created marriage, there was not just a union between a man and a woman, but there was union between them and God. And there was no need to be ashamed because they were with God. Everything was perfect. Wouldn't it be great if the Bible ended that way? If the Bible just ended there, I should say. But it didn't. Because right after that, we are introduced to the serpent. And we're introduced to Satan, and Satan comes to Eve. Did God really not say? He comes and he says, did God really not say not to eat of the fruit from the trees of the garden, that should not eat from the tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it or touch it, or you will die. And the serpent said, you will surely not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You want to know what the problem was? When God created man and he created woman, and there was union there. God knew everything, but God could handle everything. Man couldn't. But Satan appealed to the pride of life. And that statement, when he says, God knows, God doesn't want you to be like him, Eve, but don't you want to be like God? Don't you want to know everything? Well, to know everything, folks, is a tough thing. It comes with a lot of responsibility. And it's not that God doesn't want us to not have responsibility, but God knows we can't handle it. And that's why God told them not to do what they did. But when sin entered, when Adam and Eve knew what God knew, they went from having this unity with God to being ashamed. And they realized that they were naked and they were ashamed. So they hid themselves. They hid themselves from God. They were ashamed, something God didn't want them to feel. And so when God is laying out his punishment, he goes to the woman in verse 16. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat, curse the ground because of you. In toil you will eat all the days of your life, both thorns and thistles, and it will grow for you, and you will eat plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because you were taken from dust, and from dust you shall return. Now, there are many people who say that prior to the sin, man didn't have to work. That's not true. Man had to work to cultivate the garden. But God said, because of your sin, it's going to be harder. That's what man brought upon themselves. But here's the good news, folks. One day when the Lord returns, we will be delivered from this bondage of hardship. And when you read the book of Revelation ends the way Genesis begins. It ends with a river. In the Bible, when you hear them talk about rivers means tranquility. The ocean means instability. So when you see the rivers of life, right, it means peace and tranquility. And in between that river, in the middle of that river, is the tree of life. And so it is John giving us this painting and this vision of going back to the beginning when there was no sin. And there was just man and God. How many of you, when you come home, ever hear birds singing? Raise your hand. All right. You ever think about that? Birds and how they sing? When you think of a bird, from the time the sun rises, they are evading their enemies. They're looking for food to eat, to provide for their food for their young ones. And then all of these things that they're having to deal with, yet at the end of the day, they sing. And I sometimes think about my life. I am made in the image of God. Yet, when little things happen, instead of praising God and thanking God, I often complain. I don't sing songs like that bird. But as Christians, we need to sing all the time. Even when things are bad, sing to God because we have God. It's like the preacher said last week, if Jesus is in the boat, that's all you need, and he's right. There is nothing that should ever weigh us down to the point where we are not grateful to God. We should always sing praises to God. Every day of our lives. Solomon in verse 14 continues. He says, I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, And behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. Solomon tells us that you cannot run away from the problems of life. Beloved, the works of the world never satisfy the heart. It never brings true fulfillment. Years ago, I was watching 60 Minutes, and there was this guy, I can't remember his name, but at that time, he had the world's largest yacht. And he was in the process of buying an aircraft carrier. And he wanted to turn that aircraft carrier into the world's largest yacht. Now, he already has the largest, but he's not satisfied with that, and he wants to get something even bigger. That's a microcosm of how man is. You think things of the earth satisfy you, but they only bring in more problems. You ever wonder why celebrities are often the most depressed? When I was younger and you see celebrities with their mansions and I'm like, man, you got all the money in the world. How could you be oppressed? Because it doesn't bring happiness. They think it does. But then when they get it, they realize that it's just not worth living. And they turn to suicide and they turn to all kinds of things. I was watching The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary. And they were playing this game and they were out of town and he had to stay in his hotel room. His teammates could go out and eat, and he looked at the camera and he says, you know, the Gatorade commercial, well, young people won't remember that, but growing up, there was the Gatorade commercial, Like Mike. And I remember he looked at the camera and he says, you guys really want to be like Mike? I can't go anywhere. I have to sit in this hotel room until it's game time. People want these things and they lust after these things, but it never brings them joy. What do the workaholic and the alcoholic and the drug addict all have in common? They're running away from reality and they are living on substitutes. One day that bubble will burst. We only make life harder when we try to escape. So instead of running away from life, run to God. And God will make your life worth living. Unfortunately, there are some who see suicide as a way of escape, and Solomon will have more to say about somebody wanting to die in later chapters. But the reality is, folks, it is not. According to the CDC, suicide is the leading cause of death in the United States, with an estimated 45,979 deaths 2 years ago. This amounts to one death every 11 minutes. So while we were sitting here, think about how many people took their life. It is in the top 9 leading causes of death for people ages 10 to 64. My nephew is 10. And it was the second leading cause of death for people ages, I said 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. And there's an estimated 12.2 million people that contemplated suicide. But once you choose to live and reject suicide as an option, then you must choose how you will live. And everybody in the world, everybody in this room has a choice. Will it be faith in yourself, or will it be faith in God? Every single human being walking the planet has that choice to make. One leads to life. The other leads to death. Solomon continues in verse 15 What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. In other words, you can't change everything. Now, it is likely that Solomon was quoting a popular saying in order to make his point. But beloved, if we spend all our time and energy trying to straighten out everything that was twisted, then we will have nothing left to live our lives with. And if we try to spend what we don't have, then we will end up emotionally and spiritually bankrupt. Because we're trying to fix something that we cannot fix. The past cannot be changed, and it is foolish to fret over it. I hope you all get the irony of that picture. What you did yesterday is done. When I was growing up, there was Back to the Future. There's no DeLorean you can make to go back and fix what was done. What was done is done. You can't fix it. And if you try to spend your life trying to fix it, all you're going to do is cause yourself more sorrow and anguish. But here's the good news. God can straighten out what is twisted, and God can provide what is lacking. Now, God won't change the past, but he can change the way the past affects us. For the sinner, the past is a heavy anchor that drags them down. But for the child of God, the past, even with all its mistakes, is a rudder that guides them forward. You want to know what the difference is? Faith. Faith is the difference. I'm going to look at a few examples of our Lord physically straightening what was twisted and crooked. I'm going to begin in Luke chapter 13. Luke 13, beginning, I'm going to read there in verse 10. He was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who for 18 years had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he went over to her and said, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness." And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. But the synagogue official, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, "There are 6 days in which work should be done. So come during them and get healed, and not on the Sabbath." But the Lord answered and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead them away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath?" And all this, and he said this, and all his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over the glorious things being done by him. This woman, Jesus tells us, was bent over by Satan. Satan caused it, and Jesus healed her. And rather than these synagogue officials rejoicing, they are indignant because Jesus healed this woman, and he said, "You have more love for an ox than your own kin, your own blood. This is a Jew just like you, a daughter of Abraham, like you are a son of Abraham. You should be rejoicing because God has made her well." Matthew chapter 12. Beginning in verse 10. And there was a man whose hand was withered, and they questioned Jesus, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man is there among you who has sheep, And if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take a hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched out his hand, and it was restored like the other. Then one more verse I'm going to read regarding this in Matthew 15. Beginning in verse 29, departing from there, Jesus went along by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up to the mountain, he was sitting there. And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others, and they laid them at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now, I know I have there till 39, but I'm going to stop there for time constraints. In all of those scenarios, beloved, Jesus healed people by speaking. You know, Michelle, if you, God forbid, if you were to break your hand and you went to the doctor's not going to go, Michelle, you have been healed. He's going to put a cast on it. You know why? He is incapable of doing it. But Jesus just said it. This man's hand was withered, and Jesus said, stretch out your hand, and his hand was restored like the other. What is my point? My point is, if Jesus can heal these things that no one else can do, what do you think he can do with your broken spirit? What do you think he can do? The mess that you and I have made, he can straighten out. No one else can. I don't know about you, beloved, but I've made a mess of things in my life. And I've hurt a lot of people. But I'm grateful that God is willing to help straighten it out. I'm willing and I'm grateful, that he is abounding in loving kindness. When you read the Old Testament, when God would bring the prophets, and God would lay out his punishment, yes, God was just in his punishment, but he would always tell them, I am abounding in love and kindness and forgiveness. I would much rather forgive you than punish you. I would much rather heal you. I would much rather love you than to treat you like an enemy. But if that is the road you're going to go, then you will lose. And you will suffer. And I don't want you to lose or suffer. Do you realize that that is what he would tell the Israelites all the time? I don't want this for you. But you're determined to do it. God can make a mess. God can straighten out the mess that is in your life. We cannot do this by our own power or wisdom. It's like the angel told Mary when she was going to give birth to a child. Mary was a virgin. How was it possible? And you know what the angel said in Luke 1? With God, all things are possible. God took a barren man and woman. One was 90, the other 100, and brought about a nation. If that were to happen today, those people would be in a madhouse. But God did it. With God, all things are possible. Remember that in this book, Solomon is looking at these problems from the vantage point of life under the sun. And that is why these problems seemed so difficult and so insurmountable. But as we get ready to conclude, in verses 16, he says, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and madness and folly, and I realized that this is also striving after the wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief. Increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Solomon is telling us that wisdom and experience will not solve every problem. There are people who want an explanation for everything. But if we go through life wanting an explanation for everything, we will end up unhappy and sad. Because, beloved, we can't explain everything. We can't. And God is not obligated to explain anything to us. Read the book of Job and read toward the end when God finally speaks. There's Job and there's all of his friends claiming to know everything about God, and then God speaks, and God asks Job a series of questions. And the point that God, I believe, is trying to bring home to Job is that there are things that God does that he doesn't owe us an explanation. All we have to do is trust in him. He's not going to explain everything. He never explained to Job what happened. But God is telling him, it's not my place to explain it to you. It's your place to trust in me. But have you ever wondered, what if God explained everything? What if he did? Even if he did, we might understand it less. In the book of Job, God talks about an ostrich. Do you know the ostrich is the world's largest bird, but it can't fly? How? Why? I don't know why. God does. We can spend our time trying to figure it out, or we can just say, you know what, God? You know. You know, God. So if we are puzzled by the simple, a bird that cannot fly, what do you think is going to happen if God were to reveal to us every intricate thing he knows? We would be even dumber. Beloved, God has called his people to live on promises, not explanations. In John chapter 20, when Jesus comes among his disciples, and we see doubting Thomas. Thomas doubted that the disciples had seen the Lord. And they were telling him, Thomas, we have seen. But Thomas says, unless I see his hands, the imprint of the nails, and put my finger in the place of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them, and Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst. Peace be with you. And he said to Thomas, reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here with your hand and put it in my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said, my Lord, my God. And he said to them, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are they who do not see and yes believe. Thomas said, unless I see Jesus, I'm not going to believe. And wouldn't you know it, the doors are closed, and the doors are closed, and here comes Jesus, and he says, Thomas, touch these holes and touch these sides. Do you now believe? Blessed are they who have not seen and believe. You know who he's talking about? You. None of you saw Jesus. None of you saw the holes in his hand or the holes in his side, but you believe because of your faith. God bless you. Blessed are they who didn't see but believe. You don't know what Jesus looks like, but yet you are here worshiping him. Why? Your faith has driven you here. God bless you for that. You want to know why you have faith? You, as God's people, believe in his promises. You don't need an explanation. You believe it because God said it. Praise God for you. If there was anyone equipped to solve the difficult problems of life and to tell us what life was all about, it would be Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man of his day. And in 1 Kings 4, it said that all people would come from all over just to listen to him speak. Dignitaries would come. The Queen of Sheba came and was impressed by his knowledge. His wealth was beyond calculation, which enabled him to have anything he wanted. And he talks about that in Solomon, how to him, silver was not a precious metal. He even experienced madness and folly. That is the opposite of wisdom in his quest for answers. In other words, there was nothing too hard for him. But all those advantages did not give Solomon the answers he was looking for. In fact, his great wisdom only added to his difficulties. You ever wonder why? Why would he say that? Why would he say the more wisdom he had, the more difficult life became? Well, wisdom and knowledge only increase sorrow and grief. When you think of children, when children are born and as they're growing up, they live innocently day after day. They don't know right from wrong. They don't know the complex problems of the world. They're still trying to figure things out. That's how it was in the beginning. Adam and Eve didn't have the knowledge of God, but they didn't need it. They had God. God, in a sense, was protecting them from themselves. Because if they tried to know what God knew, they wouldn't be able to be responsible with it. And we see that in Genesis 3. So God was trying to protect them from it. Don't eat from that tree, because when you eat of it, you will die. He wanted to keep them from that harm, the way parents want to keep their children from harm. But the more we seek knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, the more ignorant we become. And this only adds to the burden, because the more you start learning, the more you start realizing just how depraved man is. And the more you start understanding sin and how sin is and the corruption of sin. And that can weigh you down, because you start thinking about the evil that is in the world and the people that are perpetrating evil and all of these things, and it can weigh you down. The more you know, the more you start gathering it. T.S. Eliot said this: all knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. When Adam and Eve sinned, here's my point for saying all of this, folks. When Adam and Eve sinned, they got the knowledge of good and evil. They got what they were lusting after. But since they were alienated from God, it only added to their problems. And so when you are seeking knowledge and wisdom, and you separate God from it, that's all you get. That's all you get. Young people, when you go to school, college, whatever it is you want to do, God bless you in whatever it is that you want to do. My advice to you is to be a well-rounded thinker. The Apostle Paul was a well-rounded thinker. Get your knowledge in school, use it, but also have the knowledge of God. And realize that there are things that you will never be able to explain, and be comfortable with it. And say, you know what? That's between God and God alone. I'm comfortable with that. But the moment you cut God out, then the wisdom that you have gained and the knowledge that you have gained only becomes a constant problem. Because you're trying to find answers to complex problems that only God knows, and because you have rejected God, you are driven into madness. And it's been that way ever since. When you reject God, you reject who God wants you to be. You reject the person that you were designed to be. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians. Is it in 2 Corinthians where he talks about, I'll get to there in just one moment. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Good news is we're almost done. For some people, life may be monotonous and meaningless, but it doesn't have to be. For the Christian, life is an open door. It is not a closed circle. And it is a life where we experience the blessings from God every day. We can't explain everything, but life is not built on expectations and explanations, It is built on promises. And we have plenty promises that are found in God's word. So the scientists will tell us that life is a closed system and nothing has changed. The historian tells us that life is a closed door and nothing is new. The philosopher tells us that life is a deep problem and nothing can be understood. But the Christian knows different. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 24, I'm going to read in verse 22. For indeed Jews ask for a sign and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. The world thinks that your belief in God is foolishness. But Paul says that foolishness is the wisdom of God. And so while all of these people in the world try to find the answer is staring them right in the face. But their foolishness and their ignorance blind them to it. You, however, in this room or on Zoom or wherever it is that you're listening to this, you are not blind and foolish because you believe and follow God. And so what the world deems as foolish is actually the wisdom you should be attaining. Because God makes you complete. Here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. To be fair, much of the Bible is not systematically evil, but just plain weird. As you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors and copyists, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. He thinks it's foolish. One day, Mr. Dawkins is going to find out. One day he will find out, as we all will. It's not foolishness, folks. It is the way of life. The way that God wants us to be. Christ has miraculously broken into history to bring life to all those who trust in him. If you are living in circles, then turn your life over to him in the waters of baptism. There is nothing better than being a Christian. That is the greatest blessing, to be called a child of God. When you are a child of God, you have access to the Father. You have Jesus Christ, who is your advocate. You have God who will fight for you. And one day, you will be with God in heaven. That is the greatest blessing. We toil in this world of darkness and corruption, but we live with a purpose because we serve God. And no matter what may come, we need to be resolute, and we need to resolve ourselves to never lose trust in God. Man will fail you. God never will. Every promise that God gave his people, he kept. He promised his people, he promised Abraham a great nation. He fulfilled it. He promised Abraham and the nation of Israel a land. He fulfilled it. He promised Abraham a seed. He fulfilled it ultimately through his son, Jesus. And Jesus said, I am leaving to prepare a place so that where I am, you may be also. That's what he's doing. He's preparing a place for us, reserved for you. Lady one time was telling me she was on her way to Pittsburgh for a meeting, and she got in late, and she went to her hotel, and when she got there, they gave away her reservation. So she had him having to sleep in the car because all of the hotels were booked. You know what's great about God? He has a place reserved for you. And he won't lose your invitation. The place is reserved for you. All you have to do is remain faithful. And when you get to heaven, God's not going to be surprised. God's going to be saying, I've waited for you. Welcome home. If you're not a Christian, you're not going to receive that invitation. Man, trust in God. Enjoy the life that God has given you. Don't fret about the past, but instead learn from it. And let God straighten out what has been crooked, because he's the only one that can. If we can offer you encouragement in any way, please come as we stand and as we sing.